There it is. You've officially been welcomed to Wordsmiths of Yokohama. I'll just give you the brief overview. So moderating for us today is Frank Walter. He was our guest in April, I think, April's talk shop. He's with Export Japan, and we are in good hands today. And the lineup, we have Ruth and John McCreary, who will interview as a team, and Richard Medhurst and Louise Hill Kawai. And so thanks for joining us from wherever you are in the world.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Frank Walter. I was interviewed the very last in-person one of these, I think, actually. And then we moved to digital almost immediately. So we're going to start with Ruth and John McCreary, who work at the WordWorks, and then we're going to talk to Richard, and then we're going to be talking to Luis. And this is going to be, my general idea is to, I guess, part of the problem is I'm one of the youngest members of Sweat. And so a lot of my questions are going to kind of be for my own benefit. So kind of asking you guys, how did you get where you are so that I can get where you are, kind of thing, is probably how the line of conversation is going to go. So if anybody has any questions that don't really follow that, please put them in the chat so that we can get viewpoints that are not my how to tag along the coattails of these giants of translation that are already well established in Japan. So to get started, let's talk to Ruth and John McCreary. So John, you mentioned that you wanted Ruth to talk more than usual. Is that still on?
Yes.
Okay.
So I will lean out of the
well, we don't want you don't need to disappear. That's certainly not necessary. But
you have to realize that she's the translator, and I was in advertising, so I tend to blither.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. So yeah, so you guys both you have a family business that Ruth started called The WordWorks. Started in 1984. And if Ruth, you could start by just talking a little bit about how you met, like John, how you got interested in Japan, and how you started the company to begin with.
Okay, well, that's sort of a long story, but John and I met in graduate school at Cornell. He was in anthropology and I in sociology, and he was preparing to go do his fieldwork in Taiwan. And we decided to get married, and I got dragged off to Taiwan, my first experience in an alien culture and in a foreign language. The only language I had studied at that point was Latin, which I was pretty good at, but it wasn't very useful in Taiwan. So we were there in a country market, in a market town. John was studying Taiwanese popular religion, became the apprentice of a Taoist master, and doing a lot of interesting stuff. And I, when we went there, was thinking that, well, thesis topic, I've got to make some use out of my time in Taiwan. And I had been interested in formal organizations, and countryside of Taiwan formal organizations didn't quite work. And I started thinking, this was 1969 to 71, our first field trip. Taiwan was still under martial law. Discussing the 50 years of the Japanese period was basically illegal. The KMT government blamed the Japanese for the communist victory and so on. And therefore, almost no research had been done and published in English on the Japanese period. And I thought it would be really, really cool to learn enough Japanese to use Japanese sources and do research on social change during those 50 years, in which Taiwan went from pretty much a backwater with walled villages and feuds with each other to rural electrification and railroads and public education, and pretty civilized place. So I started studying Japanese in Taiwan with a lady who parents were Japanese, and she'd grown up there and had married a fellow who'd gone to university in Japan. So they still spoke pre-war Japanese at home. My Taiwanese at that point was better than hers, which was entertaining. And then when we went back to the States, John ended up teaching at Middlebury College, which at that time had a summer language program. So we both actually dived in and did intensive Japanese our first summer there. And I did sort of second year by myself and third year the next summer. And then I decided that I wanted to have more time to work on language before I went into a PhD program. So I got into a East Asian Studies program at Yale. And at that point, intending to continue with my social history thing. But the people I had expected to be working with on the sociology and anthropology side at Yale, two people, had both been hired away elsewhere. And I ended up doing my first semester there as sort of tutorial with Bob Downley, whom some of you may know or have known, and taught by Edward McClellan, who's a very well-known translator. And I enjoyed it a great deal and found McClellan very stimulating, and so I ended up shifting to Japanese literature. And yeah.
So like there was no prior interest in Japan except for getting to go to Taiwan and then starting, like that was kind of what brought you.
That was the stimulus, yeah. John and I had spent a couple of weeks just sort of being tourists in Japan, but we had no real interest whatsoever. But yeah, the Taiwan experience sort of sparked, a desire to learn at least about the colonial period, and then yeah, as I got deeper and deeper, I got much interested in Japan itself. Yeah.
Interesting. Did you read when you were in Taiwan or when you were starting to learn about Japan and learn Japanese? Were you reading things in translation, or was it really focused on just doing the survey work?
In Taiwan, I was just beginning to learn, and I didn't have access to any materials in English, so that was just sort of trying to concentrate on the language. And then when I was back in graduate school, there was a lot of stuff in the Yale Library in Japanese on the colonial period, which I started wading through. But
because then you move, and then you graduate Yale, and then what happens after that? Like, how do we get to where we are?
Okay, so I did my MA. John got another grant to go back to Taiwan, and I had a baby, so we took our infant to Taiwan, and then I went back to Yale in the PhD program, and got a fellowship to come here, which was sort of exciting, bringing a 4-year-old and
an appendage.
Wait, so John, you didn't speak Japanese when you arrived? Did you?
Well, actually, I had done 2 years of 2 intensive summers at Middlebury College, and then that was on top of several years of Chinese.
Oh, I see.
So I was in a very odd position. I could sort of read the front page of the Asahi Shimbun, but anything that was in hiragana and the culture pages was way over my head.
Interesting. Okay, so, and that timeline-wise, that's 1980?
Yes, we came to Japan in September 1980.
Okay.
And that's it. And the timing is really important, because what Ruth was kind enough not to tell you was that when she came home just before that first time to go back to Taiwan, I was telling her that I had some good news and some bad news. The good news was I had this grant. The bad news was that I wasn't getting tenure. And she said, and I've got some news too, I'm pregnant. So we had our daughter, we took the grant, we went to Taiwan, we went back, and when we went back, Ruth was in graduate school at Yale, and we were living in graduate student housing in New Haven, and I was house husbanding and taking care of our daughter. And meditating on the ruins of my academic career, which led, and then when I figured out about the third year of her graduate program that I needed to find a job, I thought maybe something to do with computing would be useful. So I took a free Fortran programming course, which led to spending a year, just the year before we came, as a research assistant in the Yale Artificial Intelligence Project. The AI thing was way earlier then, so that doesn't matter so much. What mattered was that when we got to Japan in 1980, and I was looking for work, I was not only a literate English speaker, with some writing and editing experience, I knew the mysteries of words like RAM, operating system, storage, LSI, things like that. Basically, I knew a little bit of computer science, which made me a one-eyed man in the country of the blind and got me my first job as an editor at DynaWord. We'll stop there.
Ah. So because you come to Japan on the grant, right? And then, so John, you get the first job at DynaWord. And then how do you make the step from the original thing that you came to Japan to do to running a translation company?
Well, the theory was that I was going to be at the Stanford Center the first year, and then the second year pursue my dissertation research. And I was pretty depressed about my dissertation topic and realized I wasn't at all interested in really pursuing it. So that second year, I'd started to get some translation work while I was at the Stanford Center. They were introducing me to people. And so I was sort of basically sitting at home being depressed and thinking about what I wanted to do. And I was like, I kind of like this translation thing. I mean, people are willing to pay for it, and instead of jumping up and down and complaining, as McClellan always did. And I found engaging with the text and learning more about Japan through them quite fascinating. So I was happy to sort of start doing that. And initially I was sort of not taking anything that came my way. I mean, it was something I clearly could not begin to understand. I would turn down. But I was getting a variety of work.
What were those first jobs like? Like, what kind of things were you doing in the very beginning?
Well, one of the first things, which is probably why I was sort of motivated to go in that direction, was an academic paper about a Chinese cargo of ceramics that had been, can't think of the term, had been sunk off in some bay in Vietnam, and archaeologists were investigating it and so on. So it was really, the subject matter was really, really interesting. And other stuff, something on rivers, I totally don't remember. I don't think I did that very well. And then I started getting asked to do there was, does anyone remember what it was called? There was an American institution that I think was actually backed by the CIA that was translating a lot of like newspaper articles and stuff to get out.
Was it the Japan Echo people?
No. This was an American thing. Anyway, I was getting a lot of work from them. And then sort of random introductions, like, a book on ceramics that someone had translated badly and I basically edited. And a popular religion that had a magazine in English, and I wrote a bulletin and I was doing the translation for that. All sorts of weird stuff. And I got involved, there was a thing called Whitten Associates, which was a couple years in sponsoring my visa.
Yeah, Charlie Whipple and Bonnie Kramer, yeah.
And they were giving me various things, and that included they'd gotten a big job from, I think it was Mitsui.
Sumitomo.
Was it Sumitomo?
Yeah, it was Sumitomo.
Anyway, from a Japanese bank. That this is early in the 80s, right? So they were part of, this is, Pax Japonica. This is Japan's financial sector taking over the world kind of thing. So they were expanding all over the place, and they needed English language information on how their systems work. So I ended up doing that, which was a complete mess. What was messy was that I wasn't interacting with the client, and it turned out that the people at Associates were finding that the various sections of this whole system that I was working on had been written by different people who had not talked to each other. So it was terribly inconsistent. So their end of it consisted of basically sitting down and reworking the whole thing with the bank guys. It was a complete mess. But that led, a couple of years later, another Japanese bank was also wanting to expand overseas.
Can I tell that story?
Go for it.
Okay. No, the way this happened, you have to remember, think about the early 80s. There was a lot of, there were people like us who just come to Japan, who were just getting involved in the business. It was also when SWET was founded, and also what was called the Forum for Corporate Communications. And, you know, back in the day, you've got these small volunteer organizations, people trying to figure out what they were going to do. And anybody who would volunteer for an office got elected. And I figured that if we were going to be in Japan and we might be thinking of business or something, I need to learn something about finance. So I wound up getting myself elected treasurer of the Forum for Corporate Communications. That meant that I was sitting at the head table at one monthly meeting when Glenn Davis leaned over to George Face, who was then the president of the thing, and said, you know, I've just had a query from the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, and they're looking for somebody to translate their their global online system documentation. You know anybody who does that? And I think remember George Face said to Glenn, well, I think John's wife just did something like that for Charlie Whipple and Whitten Associates. And then what that led to was Ruth getting the work, but the bank refused to work with a freelancer, so we had to incorporate her.
Yeah.
And that was the start of the WordWorks.
Yes.
Oh, I see. Did
And
that,
in the meantime, we've been doing all sorts of other stuff. But yeah.
did that drastically change the type of work that you were able to do when you started the company?
No. I mean, I don't know whether there would have been other clients who also required a corporate supplier. Yeah, I mean, that was a big project. But in the meantime, I was getting sort of random stuff from publishers and museums and so on. And fortunately, when the Long-Term Credit Bank failed, I had other things to do. So.
And did you ever like hire employees, or has it always been kind of just you guys?
Initially, it was me, and nominally John, because we had to have two people. And then a friend of ours was going back to Australia, and he had a Japanese assistant, and he sort of inflicted her on me, was the way it felt at the time. But she worked with me for 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
Good 20 years. And that was very good for quality control and sort of emotional support and lots of other stuff. And of course, then she was quite a good translator, so we could take on Waiaki stuff as well. And then we basically had more work that we could keep track of, and I was way behind on the billing. So one of our major clients said, "You are taking on this person as a bookkeeper." And I was like, "Really?" But but she's been working for 25
years.
At least
yeah.
25 years now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So she sort of keeps us organized, and yeah. So,
And has the type of work that you've been doing changed over the years pretty significantly, or is it still kind of the same stuff?
oh, very much changed. Yeah.
Yeah, the backstory here is that after 3 years at Dynaword, I wound up getting hired as an English language copywriter at Hakuhodo, the second biggest Japanese ad agency. And that led to a dozen years that were really very nice for us, because we never had any problem with things like loans and visas and things, because I was at Hakuhodo. And
Yes.
hey. At the same time, it was a good place to be, because people would come to me and say, "Do you happen to know somebody who can translate?" And I would say, "Well, as a matter of fact." And so there was a time, especially in I think the late 80s, early 90s and stuff, when we were doing a lot of advertising and marketing related material,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of slipped down.
Which is okay. I mean, it was profitable but boring. So
Not as boring as the banking stuff would have been.
well, there is that. Yes.
You have to understand a lot of that long-term credit bank stuff was translating sentences like, "To do translation X between Dusseldorf and transaction X between Dusseldorf and New York, enter the following code."
It wasn't that bad.
So, but like, so people say that you really shouldn't ever work with your spouse because it just means that you can never leave work. Like, how did that work for you guys? Like, how did
Well-
you maintain like friendly relations while work was still stressful?
Well, it's kind of you to think that. I guess part of it is that we just decided to get a second place for the office. So there was a like, okay, I'm going home now mindset, and letting go, and yeah, and I guess most of the time we get along reasonably well.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you have to realize that I wound up spending 13 years at Hakuhodo. So for those 13 years, I was commuting into Tokyo every day.
Yeah.
And sometimes staying late at night because people in the ad business do that. And so there was that period where Ruth was working out at home and our daughter was growing up. And there were occasional stresses and strains, but we got along pretty well. And then when I was notified that I should think about what I was going to do, since I would have to leave Hakuhodo in a couple of years. This was in 96. Well, actually, it was 94. That's what I had a couple of years ago. I looked around and various other possibilities. And then one day I asked Ruth, what do you think? Do you think we could work it out if I came out as your partner? And she said, maybe.
Okay.
And our daughter said, you will kill each other. But we haven't. Actually, it's worked out extremely well.
Yeah.
That's good.
I mean, it's a very helpful. I tend to be a bit stiff as a translator. And I can rewrite my stuff and improve it, but it's much more efficient to give it to John. And then I don't do what he says, but it stimulates me.
Yes.
And so it's, basically it works out pretty well.
Yeah, and conversely, occasionally, I will translate something and then Ruth corrects all my mistakes.
Okay.
Which, it's a nice working relationship. We've sort of gotten, so we're quite comfortable doing that for each other. I like to tell potential clients, that if you want an absolutely accurate translation, elegantly written, ask for Ruth. If you want bullshit and blarney, ask for me.
Okay.
Did you know that, Ruth?
Yes, I knew that.
Oh, okay. As long as you know. And then kind of to wrap up, so kind of the theme of the whole today's shop is like translators in Yokohama. And so have you guys always been in Yokohama, and has being in Yokohama kind of changed how you approach work or how you approach living in Japan in any way?
We've always been in Yokohama. We rented an apartment from a former first-year Japanese teacher of ours that happened to be in Yokohama. And I was like, Yokohama. But we, by the next summer realized what a great place we were in. And so we've basically been in the same neighborhood ever since. I guess one of the things that bothered me about being in Yokohama was, this whole thing about Yokohama, Japan's, window on the world, this new emerging thing. And I was interested more in, history and sort of deeper aspects of the culture and so on. So, but then I discovered that over the hill over there is the Kyoto Gaido. I was like, okay, so Yokohama isn't totally off the map in terms of Japanese history.
Yeah, and we live on what was basically a Jomon shell mound.
Yeah. So we've actually, so I've gotten interested in local history, and that's been a fun sort of, recreation. We've also gotten some work from the Yokohama Arts Foundation and other Yokohama institutions, which has been interesting. And yeah, I would recommend Yokohama as a great place to live.
Yes.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you so much. Are there any questions from the audience? Lynn has just confirmation. Was it the Translation Service Center run by the Asia Foundation? Is that what you were talking about?
That's
yes,
probably
yes.
it. Yeah.
And for the translation of like the newspaper articles?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Is reading in Japanese, can that be pleasurable still, or is it just work at this point? What about John, Ruth, and Richard? How about you guys? Do you read these, like, not even a novel, or like I've been trying to find some, this is kind of a personal story, but my grandfather likes to take newspaper clippings and send them to me, and I've been trying to do that, but in Japanese, and find like interesting stories or things that,
Mm.
as a way to like get out of just using Japanese for work. But do you
Mhm.
guys do that as well?
I like, I've gotten obsessed with local history, as I said. So I like reading in that area. Occasionally I will read fiction. Um, I at times I started reading the serialized novel in the Asahi Shimbun, and then I miss a day or two and I get confused and drop it. Um, but it's more nonfiction and having to do with local history or ceramics or textiles or other things that I'm personally interested in.
Mm-hmm.
John, do you?
I don't. It's interesting. I don't read so much Japanese for pleasure, though I do occasionally now because I've gotten back interested in doing research on Taiwan and intellectual history of Taiwan in the 70s when we were there. And so I read stuff in Chinese for pleasure at times.
Well then, it's a whole different ballgame.
Indeed. Yes.
Indeed, yeah. Also, just in terms of general reading, I have a separate persona as an independent scholar, so I read a lot of anthropology in English.
Mm.
And actually, in terms of getting work and stuff, over the years, one of our best clients has been Minpaku, the Japan National Museum of Ethnology. And because I know some people there, and they started sending us things. And so we've gotten to translate some really weird stuff.
Cool.
Oh, could I jump in here and suggest that we take Brenda's question to John? That seems like a really good place to fit that in.
Oh yeah.
Do you have it there? She says she does a lot of advertising and marketing translation and some for Hakuhodo as well. And she finds it interesting and fun, but exhausting. And she would like to know if you have any advice to prevent burnout, which she knows is an issue in the advertising and marketing industry.
Okay,
Maybe.
well, the main thing is I would ask what kind of stuff she's translating, because I think what I discovered when I went working for Hakuhodo is that most of what people think of as business translation is what in the ad world calls production work. And production work means that you get paid so much per word or per page, and your standard has to be good enough. There's a ton of stuff. We used to do a lot of market research stuff for Hakuhodo that was like that. You know, it's boxes and arrows and demographics and yada, 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 and the language is pretty much the same, and it can be pretty boring to do. That's one kind of work. Another kind of work at the other extreme, for ADK over the years, I've been a few times been involved in translating TV commercials or print ads for submission to overseas ad contests like Cannes or the One Show or something like that. And that's a whole different ballgame, because that's really, you have to understand what these guys were trying to do with the ad and be able to sort of make the copy sound like copy instead of.
That's much more interesting.
Which is a lot more fun.
Yeah.
But
and that's what Brenda's saying that she does a lot of. Is the creative and copywriting.
Okay.
Does she get to talk to the people who do it? Because I often see one of the reasons that worked out for me is because I actually spent 13 years as a copywriter, and I know a lot of the creative guys. And if I don't quite understand what they can do, I can call up a guy and say, "Well, come on, what are you guys trying to do here?" And figure out, say, in English in a way that communicates with the situation, from the kind of thing where in which you don't know the context, you don't know the arguments that are going on behind it, you don't know the decisions were made, you don't know, because the whole in a very important level, a lot of that level of advertising discussion is intensely political in the individuals, and because what you're dealing with is inside the agency. There's some creative people who've been briefed. They've come up with some ideas. First of all, they've had to sell them inside the agency to the account executives. Then they've had to go out with the account executives and sell them to a client. And then for some reason, maybe they've turned out to be people outside the business who are going, "Oh, wow, that was cool." But you're having now to submit them to judges who may be Europeans or North Americans or Latin Americans or something like that. you know, who if it's a peculiarly Japanese slant on something, they have no clue about what's going on.
How would you,
So it's the levels of the game.
freelancer, how would you try to develop relationships with, like, how would you try to get close to the creative side if you're going through just like the like translation arm, or just like somebody is the coordinator for all the translation? How would you?
Honestly speaking, you know, I don't know, because I didn't get it that way, you know. And actually, one of the things, even on the creative side, when we're hiring copywriters and stuff like that, is a lot of people think of the big ad agencies as, can I work for Dentsu or can I work for Hakuhodo? That isn't the way it happens, because all the work is done by project teams inside. And usually what happens is, you know, there's a creative director who has a specific need, who asks somebody, hey, do you know somebody who can do this? And it's those personal networks of who knows who knows who knows who. You get somebody picked up for it. There's no such thing as taking that kind of work and putting it out in public, like in a Mechanical Turk kind of way, and asking the people to bid on the translation. It doesn't happen.
Gotcha.
We've more than once, you know, the client has said, okay, we need to sit down and talk about this. But I've never, and maybe it's just me, but I've never, you know, gone to the ad agency that I was working on a project for and said, we need to talk about this. Maybe it's just my passiveness, but also it's sort of, you know, you're at the far end of things. I don't know how you would. I mean, I suppose you could just say, hey, let's talk and start making some connections.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. This is a question for everybody from Jennifer O'Donnell of, is there a field of translation that you've always been interested in and I've always wanted to try, but have never had the chance to?
Yeah, I was supposed to be in literary translation, obviously didn't end up there. But there is actually a novel in Japanese by a Taiwanese author that I am tentatively trying to work on a translation of. It's from the Japanese period, and it sort of really fits with my earlier ideas. On a less literary side, one of the few areas of my sort of personal interest and expertise that I haven't ended up working on is knitting. I love to knit, and Japanese knitting is now, you know, this worldwide fad. And I've helped a couple of people with understanding patterns, but I was really annoyed to see that someone else had done this sort of translation of a dictionary of Japanese Japanese knitting designs that I wanted to translate, damn it. So anyway.
John, do you want to go ahead with you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that I really like a chance to translate serious academic work. Like the most fun I've had in a couple of years was when Yoshida Kenji, who's the director of Minpaku, asked me to translate his book about Christianity and Pentecostal Christianity in Central Africa. It's a totally fascinating piece of work. But what happened was that he went originally to do his field work in Central Africa on sort of mass dancer cults, traditional religion and magic kind of stuff, which was one of my original fields. But then for various professional reasons, he didn't get back for about 6 years. And when he got back, he discovered that more than half of the dancers he'd studied had converted to Pentecostal Christianity. The spread of sort of prophetic and evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity around South and Central Africa. So it was almost 600 pages or something like that.
It was really interesting.
It's really interesting stuff.
Oh, wow. That sounds really cool. This is a slightly different question. This is less about work and more about, how do you find events and workshops and stuff in Yokohama? Or how do you find like things going on in Tokyo? Like, how do you stay in touch with the community of people who are doing similar things to you? Or do you stay in touch with the community who are doing similar things?
Okay. We've been out of the country more than half the time for the last 3 years or so. So I'm feeling very out of touch. And of course, right now, apart from Zoom, there's no particular way to be in touch. But prior to that, I was a little bit more active in Sweat and a couple of other groups. there's a group of translators of children's books that meets often-ish in Yokohama. And I've gone to some of those events. But Yokohama is, Tokyo is the place to go for those things. Yeah. And obviously online and whatnot is the way to find out.
And that I forgot to ask John about events and things.
Oh, I don't know if this is going to be helpful. What I was remembering was that when we were among the starting cohort of SWET, and one of the things we remember was that in the bad old days, or in the good old days back then, SWET often offered actual fairly substantial courses. There was Becky Davis, who was a wonderful typographer. There was a guy named Bernd Langer, who ran a designer who ran a concept company called Concept. And they would do things like run, 4 to 6 weeks, once a week on, like, I remember Bernd's course on printing, color and registration and just, all the basics of printing technology that for people who were working in PR and stuff and would be called upon to proof brochures and stuff was really important. And Becky did these wonderful courses, again, often several sessions in a row devoted to typography, fonts and all this stuff, but in real detail. And it was, and for people like us who are just starting out, these were wonderful things to go to. And I don't know what would be most relevant to people now. I can imagine, people getting like, great introductions to, well, again, if you get font, printing, color registration, well, it's all now about what goes on screens and how you do proofing and stuff. But it was stuff that turned out to be good to know. And they were very substantial. And I guess what's different is it wasn't like it wasn't like a single day workshop. It was a course.
I remember we did one day workshop on proofreading, and we sort of learned all the official ways to mark things up and what you were as a proofreader supposed to do and what you're supposed to keep your hands off. And it was proofreading is not one of my favorite things, but still it's very nice when I have to do it to know that I am making marks in a way that are going to be understandable to the others. It was also really funny because we had a lunch break and there were 8 of us at one table and 7 of us were left-handed.
Oh, wow. that's a lot. But do you guys have anything about voice that you'd like to talk about?
Just that it's very, to the person who asked earlier about if you're translating creative material in Japanese, that's a super big question. And I think Victoria's advice would be really good. The only way to get that is to watch a lot of similar commercials and stuff. Because to get it like dialogue, it sounds like dialogue. And it comes across with, and what a lot of people don't realize about translating advertising is that, especially if you're doing TV related stuff, in the standard 30-second TV commercial, words have 20 seconds max. You cannot be wordy. You have to figure out, and now more than 70% of Japanese TV commercials are 15 seconds, which means that the words have 8 seconds. If there's no spoken out. If you have 8 seconds to say it, and you better get it right.
Yeah. Or we have, when translating a piece of literature or like an academic text or something, especially a longer one, how do you resist the temptation to tinker with the translation too much? Gotcha.
Okay, on my part, yes, deadlines are a very valuable way to sort of encourage me to let go of things and move on to the next project. There was one large book project that ended up taking 2 years instead of 5 months. And that was something where I found that I had to do a lot of related research to sort of get the depth of what was going on. And well, I'm glad I did, but it was,
the book here.
Yeah, but anyway. But yeah, sometimes it's hard to let go. But on the other hand, got to deliver this damn thing by Thursday. It's very powerful. So.
This book that Ruth is talking about, she actually won a literary translation, not a literary, but a translation prize for it.
It took a while.
But it
Nice.
was a mess because it's a book about Akitaranga, which is a late Edo period art movement that involved Chinese and Dutch influences and citing material in classical Chinese poetry and stuff like that, as well as Bungo Tai and
Is it that book that Lisa is holding?
yeah,
I
we can't see what Lisa's holding. Yes, that book.
that
Yes.
book. Oh, you have a copy. How nice. Okay.
There we are. Wow.